I was 11 years old. I know that they had been in my world simply because once they, visited our shores and the world, they never left our world.
Yes.
That's like I tell my students when we talk about the Revolver album, if the Revolver album is referring, as, I believe it does, to the Wheel of Life or a record on a turntable, that record quite literally has never stopped spinning since they released it. It's something from that album is playing somewhere. It may be playing digitally now, but it has never stopped.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Set Listing Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson, and we're getting off the Bruce train slightly, though, of course, he always comes up. And we are going to Strawberry Fields Forever, maybe? We are talking John Lennon and the Beatles tonight, and I am thrilled to have Ken Womack here because he's recently written a book, and Lennon is one of the subjects. So timely indeed. Ken, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Jesse. I'm glad to be here, and I'm very proud to be on a podcast associated with Mr. Springsteen, living here as I do in Monmouth County. And of course, I'm proud to be a professor of English and popular music at Monmouth University, where, of course, Bruce has just magnificently gifted us with the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music. So thank you so much for having me. This truly means a lot.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. It's kind of cool that, you have this legacy of, him keeping it. There was supposed to be a conference this fall, and I and two or three other podcasters were going to go, and we were going to do a live show, and we were going to have a panel on it, but the pandemic happened.
Well, I am the proud co-host of that conference with Eileen Chapman. So
yes,
we'll get you out here yet. And we're really hoping that all of the conditions allow us to hold that conference honoring the legacy of the river this coming fall. And I know our students are excited too.
Yeah, absolutely. So just give us your elevator pitch. Tell us a little about yourself, and then we'll move on a little bit.
Sure. I am a writer and historian about the Beatles. A sometime novelist, and a person who is passionate and dedicated to teaching these kinds of artifacts. And I realize that there are very few art artifacts or objects like the Beatles and Bruce. They're obviously in a very narrow class by themselves, but I really enjoy exploring and examining subjects such as those to understand how popular art evolves and what works achieve greatness and which ones, alas, and it's most of them, do not.
Yeah, I've had your colleague Ken Campbell on the podcast, and just enjoyed talking to him immensely. And I think that Bruce talks about it, right? Like it's the I guess dichotomy is the right word, right? Like it's the seriousness of everything, yet it's still rock and roll, right? Like, and he often talks about that. And I think that's the beauty of this, is while it is pop culture in its finest, it also tells us a lot about ourselves. And I think that's an interesting discussion. There's another podcast that I listen to. Andrew Hickey is doing 500 songs, a history of rock and roll in 500 songs. And he has gone through and have talked about that, like the song Stand By Me has nothing original in it. But by throwing all the pieces together, you make something greater than the total, right? And it becomes this classic. So I think you're spot on, and I'm looking forward to kind of discussing this. But before we get to that, I always like to, during now times, how are you doing with the craziness of COVID in 2020?
Well, obviously, I feel very fortunate to hold the position that I do and to work for a university that is going strong in spite of everything. And I realize just how privileged so many of us are, that are able to make ends meet, et cetera, et cetera. And it's an easy time, even though we're online at the moment, to be dedicated to our students' welfare. You can really see the struggle. I was telling them today in creative writing, here you guys are, you are brave, you're tough. You're
Hmm.
keeping the fires burning, you're writing great work in spite of everything. And I think it's a really good time here as we hopefully wind down this year, and it doesn't turn back in on itself or something.
Yeah.
As we hopefully get to the finish line and see a vaccine sooner rather than later, that we think about all the folks who, for circumstances often beyond their control, they're the industry that got hit, right? Or
Yeah.
what have you, socioeconomic circumstances, that we think about those folks. So um, I recognize that I'm doing very well in spite of everything, but it's hard not to think about all the other people who are struggling.
I'm right there with you, Ken. I've shared this on the podcast before. I had I was laid off on January 2nd. Ended up finding a new company. Got hired February 10th, and trust me, my wife and I have had the discussion. Boy, did we time that right? Fate, God, whoever you want to go it, we got lucky. And then I ended up working for a company that does roadside assistance for the RV industry. And for everyone who's been hurt, we have just exploded because traveling in an RV is one of the safest ways to protect yourself against COVID, because you're self-sufficient, you have your own facilities, you have your own area, you can still travel. And so the industry went crazy this spring and summer,
Hmm.
and therefore we were kind of blessed. And when I see my friends working in other fields like restaurants and other businesses, I am the same as you. I feel very blessed that I've been able to, not only keep working, but our company actually expanded and we're hiring people, which is kind of nice to see. So
Hmm.
good. Well, I'm glad you're doing well. Um, so we're coming up on a pretty significant date, and I know we normally try to celebrate um, our our icons' birthdays and not focus on their death. But John Lennon's death was such a shock. I'm old enough. I was born in '59. I remember the disruption of Kennedy's assassination. I don't necessarily remember the assassination, though my mother said I did come into the room and say they've killed the president. But I remember not being able to see cartoons because of the funeral. To tell you, because I was 4 or 5. But to a lot of us, Challenger and John Lennon's death is that kind of moment in time, isn't it?
Sure. And, John Lennon, more than, the tragedy of the Challenger, had a very different kind of before and after effect. It was walking through a door. You could, the space program could right itself, and did, even though we lost a certain sense of innocence when that happened. John Lennon was, it had a before and after effect. There was a door that shut, and it was, I think a lot of people are still coming to grips with it. The subject of this podcast, right? Bruce Springsteen, the next night in Philly,
Yes.
he breaks your heart. In fact, that was my paper for the conference, and I guess I'll be doing it next year,
Hmm.
and seeing you there. Hopefully, we're not in too many masks, et cetera, and
Right.
everything's right with the world. But Bruce summed it up just perfectly when he said a lot of us would be in a very different place tonight if it weren't for that guy, and it's that simple.
Yeah, what's interesting is I had a fan, Doc, was there the night before, and he told the story. And he got to the show. Doc watched the show. It was a great show. And then when he got out, his brother was picking him up because Doc was like a teenager. And the first thing his brother said was, "Did Bruce mention it? Did he say anything?" And he's like, "What? John Lennon got shot. They just talked about it on Monday Night Football." And he said, "What?" And then, um, later, they tell Bruce after the show and then the next night. So just a very different perspective. Before I get to that night, talk about maybe your personal experience with the Beatles. I had shared growing up. I was born in '59. I had two parents that were very immersed in country and Western music. Johnny Cash and Hank Williams and Charlie Pride and Merle Haggard. And I remember being at 8 or 9 visiting cousins in Ohio, and they could not believe me. This would be 68, 69, that I could not name all 4 Beatles. Because that wasn't something that listened to our house. And then obviously as I got older, I discovered the magic and that power of that music. Talk about yourself, like before we even get to specifically John, talk a little about your personal experience with the Beatles.
Sure. I was 11 years old. I know that they had been in my world simply because, once they visited our shores and the world, they never left our world.
Yes.
That's like I tell my students when we talk about the Revolver album, if the Revolver album is referring, as I believe it does, to the Wheel of Life or a record on a turntable, that record quite literally has never stopped spinning since they released it. It's something from that album is playing somewhere. It may be playing digitally now, but it has never stopped. Anyway, this would have been 1977 or so. And, I'm not a first generation fan. And one morning, my favorite cartoon was preempted. It was gone. It was canceled. It wasn't a cartoon. It was a live action show. You may even remember, called the New Zoo Review. It was absolutely terrible.
I do.
Yeah,
yes.
It was a terrible show. And it was live action, and it had giant puppets.
Banana Splits was my generation live action.
Well, I like the Banana Splits too.
Yes.
The go-karts alone, right? But
right.
It was a terrible show, but I was used to watching.
Yes.
This show, and it wasn't there, and I'm sure it was my incipient OCD, but it suddenly wasn't there, and I guess the network had the rights to show those terrible cartoons from the mid 1960s, the Beatles cartoons. Which aren't even their own voices.
Right.
And they're corny, and, at best they're corny. And I watched them, and it wasn't doing much for me, but then the songs played. And I think my first episode was Help.
Okay.
And I thought, good God, that's a winner. You just hear it and it's something extraordinary. It is that simple.
Yeah.
But there's another before and after effect. And what as I like to say in these kind of conversations, while we're talking right now, somebody's having that moment.
Yeah, and I think it
probably many somebody's.
Yeah, and
so that was my moment in 1977.
What's interesting, Ken, is a few years ago, and I'll go on if we were in a court of law, they would say, okay, get to the point quickly, Jesse. But a few years ago, my wife was out of town, and I rented the
Are you sure you want to record this part?
Yes, The Day the Earth Stood Still, the original movie, because I had never seen it. And I watched it, and at the end I went, oh my goodness, this was a great movie. It wasn't a great movie because of in context of what it was done. It stood up to the passage of time, and regardless of how you judge it, it's just a great movie. I think the same thing. Like when you hear Beatles music, it stands the test of time, whether it's their early hits or they're more toward the end when they were experimenting and doing a lot of creative things. It stands the test of time. And the people that do say, well, I don't get why they're so good, I think they're not. First, I think there's a little bit of cynicism in their heart because, well, if they're that great, they can't be cool, but also not understanding in context how groundbreaking they were as a band.
I would agree. And I think, at a certain point, not liking the Beatles is like not liking children or holidays, or
Yeah.
Thanksgiving or something. It's an unexamined kind of feeling. I know there are plenty of people, my attorney actually,
Yeah.
who are not gaga over them necessarily, but they can
Hmm.
hear them and recognize,
Yeah.
the achievement, because it is different. And and as you know, I'm George Martin's biographer,
Yeah.
and I like to give him credit, and I think he deserves it for doing something very unique with the Beatles. In fact, above and beyond even Bruce, and that is to take them from a teeny bopper band in 1963 and 64 to proliferate a proliferation across every demography, in every demographic sector. It's quite unusual. I mean, even the single Yellow Submarine backed with Eleanor Rigby is case in point.
Yeah.
You can be a 2-year-old or a 92-year-old, and there's something for you on that record. And their demographic expansion between 64 and 66 is unmatched. And the Spotify numbers, you may have seen these in Billboard recently, that almost exactly match where the Beatles were in 1967 in
Wow.
terms of their infiltration, and that sounds like invasion, right? But
Yeah.
in terms of their success in those very same sectors, it's quite remarkable.
Couple things. I was lucky enough to have Maureen Van Zandt on the podcast about a month or so ago, and she was talking about that she never listens to either Little Steven's or Bruce's albums early. She always waits till the release day, and she says it's partly because she remembers being a teenager and eagerly waiting to get that new Beatles album and to
Now
throw. What?
that's a Beatles household right there too.
Yes, it is.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
I mean he knows his stuff.
Yeah.
I met him the year before last. We were at a reception for a benefit, and he said, "So you're the Beatles guy?" I said, "Oh yes, sir."
I'll
And he
take that.
said,
Yes.
"Tell me something I don't know." And I said, "Huh?" I said, "Well, did you know that when they were working on Can't Buy Me Love in January 1968, Norman Smith accidentally erased part of the hi-hat, and he had to go back in and re-record it because the Beatles were in the United States." And I got the seal of approval. So
that is very cool. And I think you're right. The idea of them still being relevant and still being listened to today. During the pandemic, a few months ago, A Hard Day's Night was on Turner Classics or something, and I had not seen it in years, and I ended up putting it on the DVR, and I sat down and watched it, and was, first off, a fun movie, but the amount of songs, I'm like, was this like, did they take their greatest hits CD and like build a movie around it? No, it was just the songs they had available at the time.
that's exactly right. I discovered them when I'm 11. And my parents were not music lovers. My dad enjoyed classical music. My mother really almost no music at all. And but they were scholars. My mother was a geologist. My father was a physicist. And they did what you do when you suddenly become passionate about something. They went to the downtown library. This was in Houston. And they came back and brought me all the Beatles books and said, study, learn them. And of course, that's when there, quite frankly, were very few Beatles books, but they brought them
Yes.
home. Later that year or the next, the University of Houston downtown was having an art film festival. And my father noticed that A Hard Day's Night was playing. And it's interesting, and I think it's impactful for me, that was the first time I saw that film in this room full of, cinephiles and film scholars who afterwards, of course, held this talk
Hmm.
that I was probably just shy of being ready to understand at 11 or 12. But it was it's interesting to me that it happened in this space where I wasn't presented with this movie and and people said, this is a fun film, right? Or a musical romp, or a rock musical review, and all of those phrases that they used to describe it when it first came out. It was being presented as an art film. And I think back on that now, and I do believe that probably already had me thinking about the Beatles, because of course they had broken up,
Yes.
9 years earlier, I thought at the time, and really closer to 10. And so they already seemed past. Well, they were past in a lot of ways, but because of the breakup, with an underline. And so in any event, it kind of concretized for me the fact that, here we are looking at this piece of art and not a working band.
Yeah. And it is weird when you think about 10 years, right? That, roughly that they were together, and how much influence and how much music they made.
Right. And it's, it's even more dramatic when you think about their recorded output, which is barely over 7. It's 7 years and 2 months. It's quite staggering how narrow that space is for them as these kind of working artists. The George Martin moment is from June 6, 1962 to August 18th, 20th, somewhere in there, 1969. You're on mute.
I had not realized it was that short of a time. And that is fascinating. And the creative chemistry of them working together, really the cliche, right? Like capturing lightning in a bottle, and how much, but I know they worked at this too.
Absolutely. And they also, despite their tender years, I mean, what's Paul McCartney, 27 when they end? Well, I guess he's 28 at that point, but despite their tender years, it's quite amazing when you think about the fact that they were conscious that what they were doing was important.
Yes.
And they said, they were essentially realizing just about the time George Martin was, blowing up that demography we talked about earlier. At around that time, that's when they start to realize, hey, wait a second, this is bigger than us. Mm-hmm. There is something powerful at work here. And as I tell my students, they did capitalize on that moment and became ambitious. And, the one other person that I see in the history of this business who really does that is, in fact, Bruce, who, especially in the 1970s and moving really toward Nebraska, you can watch him in almost real time making decisions about the course of this artwork that he is now privileged to make. It started as one thing, but by the river, it's something else.
And Ken, do you believe, because I have heard people make the argument that after Born in the USA, and it is so explodes in this mushroom of success, right? Like it's everywhere, that he may have, ton of love and disbanding the band specifically may be like trying to control the wildfire that was his career.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that kind of moment. And, the thing that does separate him from any conversation with the Beatles is what we just talked about. He doesn't work for 7 years and 2 months. He has a very long career. It is a career that's still going. It's one that's still evolving with him as he moves into, I don't want to call him, he doesn't seem old to me, but older age, right?
Yes.
It's a powerful, he continues to have access to an evolving muse. And I'm sure we could find plenty of people who would say, well, he's just not, as good as he was with the river, or perhaps later, or what have you. And those folks always exist.
Yes.
But I think what they're not understanding, and maybe it's just because my training is in English literature, so it's always been about studying, words, and in this case, words and music as art objects, right? And when it comes to Bruce, he's a guy who is blessed with longevity. You know, the Beatles, they did a very smart thing by breaking up. They walk across that street, and they don't do anything else ever again. It's a foursome. It's over. And that creates a mystique that's very effective for them. What we get with Bruce, though, is this kind of evolving artistry where we can follow him, even pre-fame, pre-Columbia,
Yeah.
from what he was trying to do working in the clubs all the way through, the album that was just released. It's remarkable. And what I try to challenge people to do is to think about the fact that we are privileged to watch this artist develop in the same way. If you read the poetry of W.B. Yeats, right, you start off with the early Irish poems, and by the end he's saying huge things about the troubles in Ireland and the state of being alive and all of these sorts of things. And that's what Bruce is doing. And frankly, I mean, Western Stars, to me, was a revelation. I still haven't stopped admiring it.
I have said that it is almost like it was a collection of Elmore Leonard short stories.
Very nice.
Right? That it felt like that. You felt like Raylan could be in one of those characters.
Last song, what's the last song?
Moonlight Motel?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
John Landau, I was talking to him for some business with the university.
Yeah.
And he said, when you hear the album, spend some time listening to that. And he's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's an extraordinary achievement. That song in particular, it's so detailed, every nuance.
Yes.
You know what it is? It's think about, the first album, right? Where you have all this manic energy. Is what did Bruce say? He said it when he was interviewing, he was doing the interview with Bob Santelli here at the university. He said, I had my rhyming dictionary out. I was trying to be a poet and act like one, like we do when we're young.
Right.
With Western Stars, every moment, it feels choreographed and deliberate. That's a powerful piece of art. I apologize.
I totally agree with you. And I do just need to get your feeling on. I had Daniel, who is a fan, on the podcast a few months ago, and he said, Jesse, I need you to think about this. I'm at the reunion show in '99, and I'm going, this is it. They've come back. We've gotten a tour. This is the apex of my fandom. They may every few years get together, do like the Eagles. I don't think they're going to become the Beach Boys where they tour every year, but they'll do every once in a while, they'll do a tour. But this was it. And he said, if you had told me in '99 that we had The Rising, we had Magic, we had Wrecking Ball, we had the Seeger Sessions, we had Western Stars, and oh my God, Letter to You. Right. He said, Broadway, the Western Stars film. He says, I wouldn't have believed it. And, you think about how far his career has gone since then in this stage.
Yeah, and he is not a nostalgia act. And I see what Daniel must have been thinking there in '99, right? This is going to become that kind of experience. And Bruce was not going to become the Eagles. Yes. I wish the Eagles had not become that version of the Eagles, right. but they did. And I'm sure there are plenty of reasons why perhaps, they were a band prone to violence. I'm sure there was plenty of reasons why they couldn't be that group, but man, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm almost more impressed with the what he's done in this century, even compared to the '90s. Certainly, yeah. And there was nothing wrong with the '90s, mind you.
No.
And I caution people. I was lucky to see the Broadway show a couple times, and I would caution people, as they were gearing up for their visit, that this was not going to be some memory lane kind of experience. He was taking us into a place where, using, obviously the stories from his book, he was forcing us to think about our own stories. I remember the one about his father going into the bar to get his father,
Yes.
and what a foreign place it was. I tell you, both times I heard that, I thought, damn, is he talking about me? And, the time
Yeah.
I had to go in and mom said, go get your dad. And I'm like, really? I have to go in this bar? I'm like
Yes.
8 or 10 or whatever,
Hmm.
or 12. And it doesn't even matter what the age is. I was underage, and it was like walking into a foreign land.
It was.
Yeah.
And, and like um, I was able to go to multiple shows on the second River tour, and there were a lot of highlights, but Independence Day really hit me strong that he is now probably older than his father was at the time, that he wrote this song as a young man. He's now seeing it as an older man. He's done both sides of the perspective. And it really struck me. And I saw my own struggles with my son and my struggles with my wife and, our son, because, a strong-willed teenager and a strong-willed, mom, a strong-willed dad, that argument back and forth. And I saw our relationship in that song. And I agree with you. There is so much in Broadway that you go, yeah, I think about that. I know that.
Yeah, and it's great writing at the end of the day is what it is, because he's setting off these little tiny explosions, right, with
Yeah.
various points in his narrative that, at some point or another are going to catch somebody if they're paying attention and take them to another place.
Yeah, I had the writer Ron Martz, who has written a lot of different comics and novels, and he talked about Bruce Springsteen and Stephen King are the two biggest influences on his writing. And we were talking about the From My Home to You, segments that he's been doing this time. And I'm quoting Ron because I want to give him credit. He said, "We knew he was a good storyteller. Why are we shocked that he can tell stories in any format he wants?"
That's
Right?
right.
Like, and I'm like, you're right. I mean, of course he can. Of course he can weave the story by picking songs and telling stories. It's amazing.
Yeah, and he recognizes the elasticity of his music. Certainly, I think it survived into later incarnations of the show. That dark version of Born in the USA.
Mm.
Uh, a great artist recognizes that their work can be reconstituted,
Yes.
and I thought that was pretty powerful.
Yeah, I've said this many times. I've never been a fan of the blues version of Born in the USA. I like the anthem, and so I'm at Broadway. I was lucky enough, through the grace of my lovely bride, to go. Because I'm in
It's not all
Dallas.
fussing and fighting there in that household, right?
Right. Yeah. No, no, no. No, she's very loving and caring. And so she's like, you've got to go. You've got to go. So I'm sitting there, and he tells the story, right, of not making the draft and the physical. And then he says, but I often wonder who went in my place. And then he plays that bluesy version of Born in the USA. And I go, oh my God, I've been wrong this whole time. This is absolutely the perfect version of this song for this. And it is just, yeah. And not to make this a review of Broadway, but it was funnier than I thought it would be. I found myself laughing and sharing tears. So absolutely, I agree. So as Lil Steven says, you're the Beatles guy. Talk a little bit about, as you got into this, what made you decide to start writing about that and doing that research?
Well, I wouldn't be doing anything if it weren't for a guy named Mark Lewison, who in the late 1980s published the Beatles recording sessions. And I would argue that book probably is the reason why we have many of the best books about Bruce. I was talking to, Peter Ames Carlin recently, and we were having this very discussion about, where our business came from.
Yes.
And it really came from being able to have reference works like that were authoritative, or at least as authoritative as they could be at the time, that gave people a reference work. And I couldn't do anything without the many, many fine reference works that now exist in this field. That's not the work I want to do. I'm interested in trying to understand this kind of artistic evolution. And there are, I would think this fellow named Keith Badman the other day who constructed, I think he calls them his Beatles diaries, but really they're just day by day, quotes from every news source that the Beatles spoke to. So the books are, like this thick, right?
Yeah.
And, you can't work without those kinds of books. And it's just a kind of passion for trying to understand that unusual trajectory that they have. I still don't think I have a handle on it. But it just endlessly fascinates me. And, I imagine you're the same way. I love them. I love Bruce, but I would love to see a legitimate pop explosion of music that will have their kind of timelessness. I haven't heard it yet, but I sure hope that comes along. Dethrone them for all I care.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, that's inspiring to me. It's inspiring, and I think it's inspiring to our students, as we talked about a moment ago, when I can say, look what these guys did. They were sick and tired of each other. George Harrison quits that band in January 1969. A week or so later, he comes back and he says, heart of hearts, I should be here with you guys. I.e., even though I can't stand how you treat me as a second-class citizen, what we're doing is more important. And, I think that kind of recognition of where you are in the moment is really something.
Yeah. There was I ended up picking up last year a novel, Once There Was a Way, What If the Beatles Stayed Together, by a guy named Bryce Zabel.
Yeah.
And fascinating alternate history. And he had some fun with it, and what they would do, but the premise was that because they ended up being, Johnny Carson came back from vacation and was on the Tonight Show with them instead of Joe Gargiola, that him and
that would have helped in itself.
Yes, and he said that when they clicked, and him and Ed McMahon talked about how they were always there for each other. No matter what happened, they were always up for each other. And that made John and Paul kind of click. And that was the whole for the want of a nail, the alternate history, that changed them enough that they stayed together. And I think that's because you're talking about like George, like, I know this is where I should be. There is a greater music here.
Well, having said that, I do think that they needed to break up. I think that was, commercially, it was the smartest thing they ever did.
Right.
It created a mystique that exists right now.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, part of the reason we're talking tonight was the other reason why there was never a reunion or any kind of part two, act two.
Yeah. And it, well, let's talk about that. So first off, let's talk about your book. So tell us, give us a little bit about it, and then I want to go into your memories of that night.
Sure. It's called John Lennon 1980, The Last Days in the Life. I wanted a book that was not a true crime book, and sure enough, here we are in the late stages of this 40th anniversary year, and there are plenty of them.
Sure.
I didn't want a book that was gory and had violence in an archway. I wanted to know about, what was the progress like from roughly December 1979 when he sees George Martin for the last time to, the last day. What is that like? And, I wanted, when you write a book, right, you want to experience a life on, like a camera on the shoulder of your subject.
Yes.
as they make their progress from beginning to end. And, it was an end, all right. But it was a rule that really helped me because I didn't stray from that kind of focus. So in other words, there are plenty of salacious stories about what may or may not have been happening in their lives during that period. And as you know, Goldman had his salacious book from in the 1980s. This is not that book. I only care about what the artist is seeing and what he wants to do to try to make this thing, which is very risky, happen. It's the world he left in 75 is not the one he's coming back to in 1980. It is a very competitive marketplace. There are lots of genres like coming together and
Sure.
clashing. Disco is still running the world. You've got all the dinosaurs. They didn't call them dinosaurs yet, but they were walking the earth, and lots of new music coming. There's a new British invasion. You can already see the sort of embers of it coming over the horizon. And this is the place that he and Yoko plant their flag in November 1980. It's a tough, tough marketplace. So there was risk involved. But the payoff to me is so magnificent because you can see him as you spend time with him, watching him craft all of these demos. And of course, many of them he'd started some years earlier in the late 70s. You can see him gaining confidence. And in my absolute favorite moment, and we owe Yoko Ono that this even exists, she had written an essay about it. John was determined to have this big hit record so he could go back to England. He had not been there in 9 years. So the last time John ever goes to England is 1971. He wants to go home and have a homecoming with his relatives, many of whom he's still close to. Wants to ride. He said he wants to take an ocean liner up the Thames and triumphantly, ride into, I guess, into London like an invading conqueror or something. But I think he really just missed folks and missed England. And he wanted to do it on the back of a hit record. And, as Double Fantasy did not explode out of the gate.
Right.
14-year-old me was thrilled that all of my Beatles were doing something.
Sure, absolutely, yes.
I couldn't believe it. I followed the stories when all the press releases started to come out that maybe John and Yoko are making a record again. But it was, it came out slowly in that way, and Yoko felt bad. She felt bad because she knew how much John wanted this big moment, and it wasn't coming. She thought it would happen, but it wasn't happening yet.
Mm-hmm.
And she came to him there in the sitting room, I guess about a week, 10 days before he was murdered. And she said, it just isn't, I'm sorry. And he said, it's okay. We've still got the family.
Oh, that's nice.
Isn't that wonderful? Because John Lennon in 1972, I don't think he could do that.
No.
I think he would have felt beleaguered or troubled in some way. There's a centeredness to be able to even say that. That is inherent in that remark.
And I love the idea that he was, though, competitive. Like, he wanted to be successful.
Absolutely.
And it's because I want people to hear this music. I want that people want to hear my music. And so I love that idea.
But then the flip side, right,
yes,
is that here he is also acknowledging what it's tough for us to do. And this is a guy who only gets to be 40 years old in 2 months. And what is he thinking? He's thinking, yeah, but you know what? I love the experience. And that's what all of us could always be better at, right? Doing something, feeling like it was worthwhile, and being satisfied by the experience. And when you look at those last few months and you talk to some of the folks he worked with, you see that he was that guy. And I'm older than John would ever be, and I wish I could still be that guy. Right? You know what I mean?
I absolutely do, Ken. Every once in a while, someone on Twitter will say, hey, if you had to do a TED Talk, and you had to, someone put you on stage and like, go, you've got to do a TED Talk, what would you do? And you mentioned Bruce in the 90s. Better Days is one of my favorite songs of his, because I believe that song is all about exactly what you're talking about, that life is a journey. And instead of spending like, when I become successful, then I'm going to be happy. When the kid's out of diapers, then I'm going to enjoy being a parent. When I get that promotion, then I'm going to be happy. It's the journey. It is the enjoying the process of what you're doing. And these are the better days. And to hear the the story of John, like, hey, we've got the family. We had the experience of building this album together, and whether
And we have this
people,
great kid.
yeah, exactly. That's a great story. That's a great story. Um, I I have not a unique story, but at the time in 1980, I was working at a trucking company as a dispatcher, and I worked 6 at night to 6 in the morning, and there was not a TV in the dispatch office. So I did a lot of reading, would, at times listen to the radio, and on Monday, that Tuesday morning, when I turned on the radio and it was the local FM station, they were playing a Beatles song, which was not their format. And I immediately picked up the phone and called in, and the guy answered. And I said, has something happened? And that's how I heard that John had been shot. So unlike Monday Night Football people, so talk to me your experience and that personal feeling of this shocking news.
I had a similar experience to that one. I didn't call a radio station or anything of the sort, but I remember, I guess it would have been earlier in the year, right? Hearing Led Zeppelin music on the radio and realizing, something's going on. It was out of format for the station I was hearing. Suddenly they're playing Kashmir or something, and it's, soft, it's FM, soft FM or something, soft rock. I was, I was into that record in such a big way because it was exciting that it came out. And, it was my first John Lennon release in the time when I was, this enormous young fan. And so I bought the single when it came out in October. On the day it was out, I bought it at Target.
Yes.
For all my record buying needs. And that was back when, record stores were everywhere. And then in November, purchased Double Fantasy there too. And I had the thing actually sort of displayed like a kid, like you do in your mid-teens, right? I had it sort of set up on my, actually on the shelf that's right there in this room in New Jersey.
Yeah.
In any event, that's weird. At least the stereo's gone, because that thing was not great.
Uh-huh.
My computer has better sound now, right? But anyway, I had it set up there next to my turntable, and so it was in heavy rotation in my world. And that night, I'd gone to bed early for reasons, who knows? It was December. School, I'm sure, was killing us. I was in the orchestra and practiced my French horn a lot, so usually the first of the week was pretty exhausting in that world. And I'd gone to bed early, and we would have been an hour behind down in Central Time.
Right.
And I was laying in bed, and I had my door shut. But you know how when your parents are coming when you're that age?
Yes, I remember.
Because you just know. It's the same way I knew my mother's cough in a store.
Yes.
So I could decide, am I going to shuck and jive my way out of here? What's going to happen? Or am I going to get in trouble for the thing I shouldn't be doing? It was usually that. But anyway, I could tell it was him coming down the hallway. And I was tired, even though I was still awake, and I didn't want to be bothered. And I talked to him about this recently, and he sort of pushes open my door, and I can hear him, and I'm pretending to be asleep, and he shuts the door and left. And the next morning I came down, and there it was. He put the morning paper on, where my breakfast, where I had breakfast, and he'd heard it on Monday Night Football. Like so many others. And it was just, I've never gotten over it. It's worse. It's been worse since I've been older than he ever got to be, because you realize just how you were nothing at 40. I mean, there are, it's incredible. You're just, you've barely lived. I mean, even though he certainly lived an extraordinary life.
Yeah.
It just, you hurt more for his family, and his boys and Yoko and the people that they loved, because it's just, it's despicable. There's so many senseless things in the world. But then, this book helped me a lot because, now I know that within an hour, very likely, of that terrible thing happening, he's in the studio and they're listening to one of my favorite songs by John and Yoko, or we should say Yoko and John, in this case, Walking on Thin Ice.
Okay.
And John is so excited by it. Forget this thing they just made together, right? He says, that song, he said, this is the direction.
Wow.
In the last hour of this extraordinary person's life, he feels like he's finally seen the direction. What hope do the rest of us have?
Yeah.
But it's powerful to see someone at that moment still, like you said earlier, still being competitive, still being stoked by a passion for creation.
Yeah, and what I find very interesting is, and I've had this discussion with some of all fandom have a few people that are those guys, right? The people that I don't care for the Beatles, or and there's, well, I don't see why Bruce goes to Broadway, and why is he's forgotten the little man. It's costing us such big tickets, and Western Stars, why is he doing this? And I had one fan, like, when Letter to You came out, like, 5 days. I remember when you used to take 5 months to do one song. And my point is, first off, he's earned the right to do whatever the heck he wants to do. And secondly, as a fan, I applaud that he is trying new creative endeavors each time, that he is trying to find something different.
Yeah.
And to hear that one of John's last interactions was with his favorite for all, he adored Yoko and loved working with her, and he's excited about what they're doing together, is a very sad memory, but it's also a happy memory. Like,
That's right. 12 years into a marriage, right? And you are
yes,
somebody's best cheerleader. I don't care what's happened in your marriage. They had their ups and downs, but
sure,
they fought hard for each other that year. And
yeah,
time after time, you can see the remarks that she provides that support that.
this is I love the idea, as you said, you didn't want to do a true crime, you didn't want to do a gore, you just wanted to get into a significant person in your life, and their final year. Is there a couple things that surprised you found in your research?
First of all, I have no idea when they found time to eat.
Okay.
I've seen photos, in the studio where Fred Seaman, their assistant, is bringing in food, and so that must have been the answer. But it was almost like Beatles times. They were so busy running from one thing to another, and they'd gone from a period of a more sedentary existence. So, but I don't know if I was surprised by that. It's a revelation.
Okay.
I suppose one of the myths about his last year is that he writes all of this music in Bermuda. He does not.
Okay.
He had been working on some of it even before he returned to Yoko in the Dakota. Much of it was written, even 2 years earlier in the case of Watching the Wheels. He'd had this song he was kicking around with different titles, probably recognizing it because he would know better than most that this was something special and it needed to percolate in that way. I had a ball running down some of the blind alleys in John Lennon scholarship. For example, the story of one of the most beautiful songs in his late years, and that's "Grow Old with Me," which was on the Milk and Honey posthumous album. And Yoko had written in the liner notes about how John had seen a baseball film. And I thought, well, now why the hell has nobody ever found out what film it was?
Sure.
And so I spent a good bit of time watching, dozens upon dozens of the hundreds of movies, by the way, about baseball made between, roughly, the 20s to
Sure.
to the year John died. And she was off the mark on her guess at what period it had been, but that only made it more fun. And I found it by, getting copies of TV Guide and studying. John loved TV,
Yeah.
and here's the thing that also excited me, and it's going to seem simple and not perhaps the kind of thing that reviewers look for. It was such a smaller world. You and I watched the same shows John Lennon did.
Yes, we did.
There's just no doubt about it. He liked, a Donna Summer song or two that we probably liked. It's
Yes.
just because they were good, and
Well,
it was such a smaller place. He didn't miss Saturday Night Live for the most part. When it came on, he
yeah.
watched.
Right.
And
And
so
there's that.
I was fascinated by that. But
Yeah.
anyway, the baseball film was some made-for-TV thing that barely ever played on television at all. It was in fact, I had to have it digitized so I could watch it. But there it was, the
Mhm.
poem being read in a scene.
What's interesting, right, is I remember the book telling the story about him and Paul watching Saturday Night Live when um, you know they make the offer, right, that
Yeah.
and at the end it was too late. They were actually, though, tempted to go down there. And yes, we're going to sound like a couple of old farts, right? But um, I grew up in Louisiana, Lake Charles, so I'm 3 hours away from you.
I know
Uh,
it well.
yeah.
Part of my youth was in New Orleans. We lived there
Okay.
for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. So, you had the three stations and maybe a UHF station. I mean, I moved to Dallas when Fox became the fourth major station. And what was weird, you probably didn't experience this in Houston or New Orleans, but Lake Charles was small enough that the NBC affiliate was in Lake Charles, and there was an ABC affiliate both in Beaumont and Lafayette. So you could choose which ABC
How about
station you
that?
wanted, and a CBS station also in Beaumont and Lafayette. And so it was strange, right? That when I moved to Dallas, I'm like, what do you mean you have all major station networks? That is weird. I had never thought of that. Do um and I guess it is senseless to think about it, but we all do. um any speculation, if this horrible murder hadn't happened, what might have happened?
Well, I mean, I like to believe that, we would have seen John on his world tour in 1981 that he was planning, and hopefully he would have had a great experience. It's so hard to say because when we look back at those years, they're certainly not like the year of COVID right now, but
Yeah.
but it's a busy, crazy world. It's hard to predict those things. I think, um, unfortunately, and I don't want people to take this the wrong way, but and by the way, when anybody ever says that, it's like here comes something that you could very well take the wrong way.
Yes, exactly.
I hate like hell that he died that way and that he's dead at all. Um, but I don't know that they would have done much for their legacy by getting back together,
Right.
because everybody was getting back together in the 80s. And a
Right.
lot of times it was just awful. I mean, Leonard Skinner, they had a reunion tour and they were 2/3 dead,
Yeah.
So I think they might have tarnished what they'd accomplished, or they would have been amazing, right? Who knows? We
Yeah.
will never know. Um, but I think there is something to be said for leaving that body of work in the
Yes.
shape it was left.
Right.
And I'm not against remixing or mashups or all of the things that the Beatles have done through Apple, or with Giles Martin. I'm fine with all of that stuff.
Sure.
I mean that they left their artistic legacy in a place intact. And, John would say that over and over again when he talked about the reunions. You've got all this great music. And he was right. It's the only thing that ever really mattered.
Right.
We can talk about the films and Beatle wigs and all sorts of nostalgia paraphernalia that I've never been interested in. But the only thing that matters is the art object. And the best thing they do is secure the ownership of the sound recordings.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that mattered. And he would say that. He would say, if we get back together, it will not be that band. It'll be the band of us now in
Yes.
1985 or whenever.
Yes.
And he would also note just the sheer impossibility of what that would mean. It wouldn't mean a nostalgia act necessarily for people. When you think about the money, though, that was starting to be, and I'm sure you remember this even better than I did, being a couple of years older. I mean, it was already in the hundreds of millions of dollars
Yes.
in 1979 and 1980. It was on its way to $1 billion.
Yes.
And, I forgot if it was McCartney or Lennon said, when it gets north of $1 billion, how do you ignore the opportunity to change the life of a country,
Yes,
or what
exactly.
have you? I mean, they're
Yeah.
all, deeply progressive humanists, and that
Yeah.
would have been tough to ignore. And I don't think they would have.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting. And you're right. Would this, because I go back to the people that want darkness on the edge of town again, or they want Born to Run again, and versus and Paul has experimented and done Wings and gone and made a lot of music, and you wonder, it would have been different. It would have been, and I think you're right that we, as he said, this would have been this band, and we could not duplicate that again. Um, as a fan, I would love to see that, but I tend to
Hey, I
be,
would have been there buying scalper
yeah,
tickets at
yes,
ungodly prices. So
yeah,
don't get me wrong.
and I tend to be an optimist. My lovely bride always says, "Well, of course you love Bruce's new album, Jesse. It's you." I'm like, "Yes, it's fair, right? It is that." Uh, that's a very interesting. Um, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book. But if you could, how do you sum up his legacy?
Well, I don't in the book.
Okay.
I mean, I do in a way. I just, you're not going to see a murder in it. It's what I try to do is, and when I get on the flip side of that, just keep pushing further and further away until Sean Lennon has the last word in the book
Okay.
about a memory. He and his father, they, when you're 5-year-old, right, you've got something you do with your kid, and it's
Yeah.
kind of your thing. Mine was apparently to pretend I was asleep when my father came to, visit
Yes.
me.
Give these important stories. Yes.
Yeah, but his was that John would come in and he would turn out the lights like parents do, and he would sort of flick those old switches, and he'd say, "Good night, Shawnee," and he'd flick it so there'd be, the light kicking back
Like
on
a
and
strobe
off,
light. Yeah.
like a strobe light, and he'd say, "See you in the morning," and Sean would lay there, and he said he would watch the shadows and the headlights from the cars, down below on Central Park West, and they would create these shadows on the wall. And he said, it reminded him of his dad's song, and I wonder if he was looking at the same shadows.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, so I think his legacy is the music. I mean, no disrespect to our first generation fans who were there in 1964 losing their minds at JFK, right?
Right.
But most everybody who ever discovers the Beatles will not have that experience. In fact, because, and I think you'd agree that they're going to be around in 200 years,
Yeah.
it will be a minute amount of people who experience that in real time. That doesn't mean that they're not special. Surely they are.
Yeah.
But, it's like we said earlier, a kid is listening, who's, listening to the Beatles tonight, discovered them on YouTube or wherever and said, "What the hell?" And she went
Yes.
and she played everything. And she's not going
Yes.
to play it in order, by the way.
No, she
If
isn't.
she goes to Spotify or iTunes, the first song that's going to hit her is "Here Comes the Sun." And good for her. She's going to click that song. She's not going to click "Love Me Do." It's not going to be up to the right. So they're going to be able to experience them in their own way. And, 20, 30 years from now, they'll experience the Beatles and discover them in ways I don't know that we can imagine yet, even though, God help you and me, we've been through a lot of format changes.
Yes, we have.
My favorite line about the Beatles is actually, who is it in Men in Black? Tommy
Yeah.
Lee Jones. When he sees that new format, he's like, "Great, I have to buy the White Album again."
Well, you made me smile your parents. And I have told this story so many times, but summer of '77, I had just graduated high school. A Saturday night, don't have anything to do. I go to the local mall.
Are you
I
still in
walk.
Louisiana then?
Yes, I am. Lake Charles, Louisiana, Prion Lake Mall. I walk into a Montgomery Ward's, and I go to their music department, and I pick up the Beach Boys' Endless Summer 8-track. And I'd never heard really, maybe vaguely, the Beach Boys, um, maybe because 15 Big Ones had come out in '76, but I vaguely, and I put that 8-track in my car, and I went, oh my gosh, what is this? I've never heard anything like this, right? Because I'm listening to AM radio. I'm listening to Elton John. I'm listening to Queen. I was a huge Kiss fan at the time, right? Just the whole drama and everything. And oh my goodness. And so I'm exploring everywhere I can to try to find out who is this Brian Wilson guy and what is he doing? And going to the library and trying to find books on the Beach Boys and talk about not finding books, right? And looking up encyclopedia articles and looking in magazines and trying to look back pages. And so what's beautiful now is you talk about that teenager is on Spotify. She listens, and now then she can pull up Wikipedia or other thing and look and see, similar to what I do. One of my other podcasts is I do a Doctor Who podcast. When I watch a classic Who episode, I then go afterwards and do all this research about, the stories behind the story and
we want to know more.
Yeah, exactly. And now you have that.
And people are always going to want to know more, right? So
Yes.
that we live with, but it's that period of discovery that you really only get to have once.
Yes. And what is it? I can't remember who, but someone said I envy you because you're going to get to hear that. You're going to hear Yesterday for the first time. You're going to hear, Strawberry Fields for the first time, or any song, right? You're going to hear that first time, and you can only hear it once. If I Fell in Love with You continues to be something that just is magic to me. When that harmony and that beauty and the simplicity of the song, yet it's so complex, just something amazing. Ken, I have taken way too much time. I appreciate you so much. But before I let you go, we had talked before I hit record. I end every episode with the Mary question. So real quickly, Jay Armstrong is an honors English teacher in the Philadelphia area. And he always takes 2 days, and his seniors, they break down Thunder Road as a poem. They go through all the lyrics. He talks about the imagery Bruce uses on the song. They talk about the themes. He compares it to Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. And then at the end of the 2 days, he asks his class, does Mary get in the car at the end of Thunder Road? So Ken, that is your question. Does Mary get in the car?
Yeah, she ain't a beauty, but hey, she's all right.
Yes.
So I think there's just enough mystery with this guy that she wants to know more. I think she gets in the car.
Okay.
I could see the argument the other direction, but I think it's just daring enough that she's going to jump in that car. I think there are other songs that he has where perhaps it goes another direction, but in this one, yeah, Mary's going to show up.
So I saved this story.
She's a comer.
Yeah, I saved this story, but to go back to Moonlight Motel, I had a guest right after Western Stars came out, and he said, yes, she gets in the car, and they drive to California together. They spend a life together, and Moonlight Motel is him mourning Mary's passing.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot.
And I said, I don't know. Yeah.
What's the first song on that album?
Hitchhiker, right?
Yeah. Wow. That is such a big 1970s song. I don't
Right.
know about you, but
Yeah.
I have enough knowledge of the 70s and being alive enough of well, I was alive for all of it, but
Yeah.
being of of a
Yeah.
person who was paying attention was really toward the end.
Yeah.
But I remember that feeling. When I hear that, it resonates with me. And like I said, I'm no nostalgia person, but
Right.
it feels like a big song.
When my parents adored, as I talked about, country music and Glenn Campbell, and so the Glenn Campbell and um, feel of the album and
Yeah.
all the album was something pretty special. So yes, I agree with you. When the guy told me that theory that Moonlight Motel was the bookend, I'm like, okay, I don't know if that may be the right answer. uh, you know, so very nice. Ken, this is amazing. I appreciate it. I cannot wait I know that we are going to have this seminar either virtual or in person. I think it's going to be great. I love the work you guys are doing to to uh, to preserve Bruce's legacy and his music. And much like the Beatles in 200 years, I think in 200 years, Springsteen's music will still be listened to and will be enjoyed. And I also think that it will be used to tell history the way, that you guys already do in a couple of the classes there. So I think it's just something pretty special, and I appreciate all y'all's work.
Outstanding. Well, I hope you'll sit down on my class next semester. I'll be giving you a call.
That sounds great. All right. So if someone wants to reach you, how can they, and how can we get the book?
Well, you just go to kennethwomack.com and, it'll take you right to Amazon or your favorite bookseller.
Very nice. All right. Ken, thank you so much. Um, Listeners, you please stay safe. Remember to social distance. Remember to wash your hands. Remember to wear an effing mask. We've got to be here for each other, and we will talk to you soon. Goodbye. Doing a podcast at times can be a one-way conversation, and I hate that. So please let me know what you like and don't like about the work I'm doing. You can reach the podcast via email at setlistingbruce@gmail.com. The show is on Twitter at setlistingbruce, and my personal Twitter is at jessejacksondfw. We have a website, www.setlistingbruce.com. From there, you can find links to other Springsteen podcasts as well as other music-themed podcasts. We have a page devoted to our own SLB All-Star Band. These are guests who have been on the podcast more than 3 times. There is a link to our store where you can purchase Set Listing Bruce shirts as well as a Merry Question t-shirt. There is a link to our Patreon page where you can sign up to help support the podcast financially. We have different levels and different rewards based on your support. If you don't have any extra cash, and right now who does, you can support the podcast by subscribing via your favorite podcast player and leaving us a review. The more reviews we have, the easier it is for people to find us. And please tell a friend about the podcast, especially if they love Bruce or music, because it will make a difference.
You just heard the fun talking, hard rocking, music loving, album ranking, fan thinking, joy spreading, lyric reading, story sharing podcast that is the one, the only Set Listing Bruce. Set Listing Bruce is part of the Southgate Media podcast group. The theme for Set Listing Bruce was written by David Rosen, used by permission.